Hello and welcome to Noise in Brief, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm news editor Siobhan Holt, and today I'm joined by our UK editor, John Harrington, and reporters Evie, Barrett and Wiredu. Hello all.
Hi.
Hello. Okay, well, we want to begin by congratulating all the winners at the recent PRWeek Global Awards, which took place recently. It was a brilliant evening and there were some outstanding entries this year. But the fun doesn't stop there. We have the winners of the best places to work coming up on the 30th of May. So stay tuned to the PRWeek website for the announcement. And then we also have the Purpose Awards, which will take place on Friday the 7th of June. That's going to be held in partnership with our Sister Titles campaign and Third Sector. And the ceremony will take place at the Londoner Hotel in London's Leicester Square, which will be very fancy. You can still book tickets, so check out the events section on the PRWeek website. As we record today's podcast, the report into the infected blood scandal public inquiry was released yesterday. The scandal, which dates back to the 1970s to the early 90s, was when more than 30,000 people in the UK were infected with HIV and hepatitis C after being given contaminated blood products. The evidence from the 5-year public inquiry shows repeated failures from clinicians and government ministers. The scandal has been described as the biggest treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. And the victims who've been campaigning for years will soon find out details on their compensation and how much. The inquiry chair, which was Sir Brian Langstaff, said in the report that it was no accident and even went as far as to say that there had been a cover-up and that the NHS and successive governments compounded the agony by refusing to accept that the wrong had been done. We must still clarify, though, that Rishi Sunak has apologised for the scandal, calling it a day of shame for the UK state, and has said he will implement the recommendations. But I just want to throw this out to you guys, really. What do you think of this from a comms perspective and the impact this is really going to have on the NHS's reputation?
I think the report is pretty damning. It says there was, quote, repeated use of inaccurate, misleading and defensive lines to take, which cruelly told people that they had received the best treatment available. It essentially says that the NHS was sort of prioritising dealing with the negative publicity over the safety of the blood supply itself, which obviously, I think just goes to show that while people often think of comms as problem solving, you really need to have the human element in mind as well and really think about your sort of personal response to these things, especially when people's health and well-being's on the line. Obviously, it happened quite a long time ago, but I think you could draw a lot of comparisons to the whole COVID situation and the misinformation, disinformation around that. I think increasingly nowadays there's a lot more public distrust in these institutions and government, and I think there is going to be backlash in terms of even boycotts and things like that. It's just this kind of thing seems to be becoming more common.
So I feel like people don't trust the government in general, so anything they say will kind of be perceived as negative. And I feel like with the NHS, people are starting to feel the same way. The report kind of said that the governments were more concerned about the reputational damages than the openness and honesty. They were more defensive than candid and more interested in avoiding financial exposure than admitting their shortcomings. When it comes to people dying and getting sick, I feel like the general public and others would feel a lot better if the NHS and the government were able to have an open and candid discussion. It would definitely help build trust and confidence back in these institutions. As of right now, I don't really feel like many people care what Rishi Sunak has to say because the damage has already been done. People are dead.
I think it sort of shows the importance of one of the basic rules of communication, of being open and being honest. So in a sense, it kind of validates all of the things that good communicators will know. And it shows that, you know, all of these years ago, these principles were just rejected for, you know, cynical and defensive reasons and with tragic results. It's really been shocking. I mean, the nearest comparison I can see to this in recent times is obviously the post office scandal in terms of the nature of a kind of establishment government cover-up is the kind of the general view. I mean, obviously this happened many years before, even before the new Labour government, you know, 70s to 90s, early 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So I do think it adds an extra layer of challenge for NHS comms people. You know, the vast majority of people who work in the NHS didn't have anything to do with this scandal. Mm-hmm. Obviously not. A lot of them weren't even working in the NHS. The vast majority weren't working in the NHS when this happened. But nevertheless, if you are working in the health services and you want people to trust what you've got to say about a certain health programme, a certain new initiative, you know, maybe new drugs, new treatments that have come on board, this kind of thing won't help. So it shows the challenge that NHS comms people have, but it also shows the importance of NHS comms people now to kind of counter this negativity and this cynicism and this lack of trust.
Moving on, Evie, you mentioned boycotts earlier on. Let's discuss that further, because we are seeing a slight rise in boycotts at the moment.
So I've been looking at a specific crisis which happened recently, actually, slightly different in nature, but yeah, like you say, similar kind of backlash. But basically, there's a music festival, The Great Escape, which happens every year in Brighton. It was held last weekend, but more than 160 acts that were due to perform pulled out at the last minute due to the involvement of Barclays Bank as a sponsor of the festival. So people took issue with Barclays' links to Israeli defence companies. In response, Barclays did tell the BBC that those questioning it had mistaken what the bank does, and they explained that it doesn't make investments in these companies but provides financial services to businesses, including those in the defence sector. But nonetheless, quite a few artists and venues pulled out, and some of these actually launched their own alternative fundraiser event, raising money for a Palestinian charity instead. So yeah, I've been speaking to some corporate comms pros and crisis specialists, basically asking about the wider topic of boycotts and how best to respond when a client is threatened. I mean, it's a difficult one. The kind of sounds like a basic point, but I suppose when you're in the middle of it, you often forget. But Amanda Coleman, who's a crisis comms consultant, said that if a business is faced with a boycott, it needs to take note of who's calling for it, the reasons behind it, and then look objectively and see whether something actually needs to change, which is kind of a good point. I don't think you can really bury your head in the sand and hope it goes away. A lot of the time, I think we've seen, especially when it's linked to sort of Israel and Gaza and things like that, people are very persistent in their kind of calling for what they think's right and really sticking to their morals.
And we're definitely seeing sort of a slight rise in this, in the sense of businesses that maybe the crisis isn't necessarily something they've done. It's a partnership or a deal. I'm thinking of the Co-op Live. You know, the Co-op name has had to face some challenges recently when it wasn't actually their, it's they're sponsoring a building and it's the building that's struggling to open. And as a result, they've had to face comms challenges. And I suppose this is a similar thing, that it was a supplier, Barclays, that the festival then faced the backlash from.
Yeah, it's becoming a lot more common and a lot more nuanced, I think. In terms of kind of how to respond, I spoke to Tony Langham, who is the executive chair at Lansons, and he said that you should be prepared to engage with all sides that are willing to do that. Although he pointed out that a significant proportion of activists no longer engage, so it's almost more difficult to have those conversations. But he actually said that sometimes you need to have a bit of a backbone and that trying to be popular won't work, which I thought was interesting.
I quite agree with Tony. I feel like when businesses are boycotting, businesses either need to take the stance of moving away from whatever the issue is or doubling down on their stance. And I know that may be easier said than done, but in the world we live in today, people don't really like half and half. They don't like people playing on both sides. They want you to have a distinct decision.
We also heard from Peter Davenport, who is a senior strategic consultant at Definition, and he said that brands should avoid acting like something they're not. And he kind of said, should banks even try to be cool? Kind of questioning whether banks should be involved in a music festival in the first place, which I guess is a bigger question. But yeah, he said you can either kind of do that or accept the short-term consequences and kind of hope that something bigger comes up. But he did point out that trying to give a factual response in the heat of all this can be interpreted wrongly. So it's not necessarily just a good idea to come out and try and explain yourself, because people might not accept that.
It's interesting. I used to go to the Great Escape quite a lot. I lived in Brighton for many years. And actually, it was a week after PR360 ended,
a very successful event.
Very successful event where there was no boycotts that I'm aware of.
No.
A few people struggled with trains, but that's about as far as it got. This feels like quite an extreme example, really, because the kind of typical audience for the Great Escape and the typical, if you like, suppliers, i.e. the bands, they're quite sort of vociferous, kind of radical, generally leaning towards young. The demographic is basically such that they're quite likely to have a proportion of the people who are quite willing to sort of campaign on these kind of issues. So I really think that was a challenge. At the same time, I think you've got to have a lot of sympathy for organisations like the Great Escape and live music, the live music industry generally, which, let's face it, has been going through a really hard time.
Absolutely.
So you definitely see why corporate sponsorship is extremely attractive to ensure that those kind of industries can thrive and survive, frankly.
When they first signed up Barclays, I imagine that was a big coup for them, that they'd got such a established brand name that was going to support, as you say, an industry that's really faced hard times in recent years.
Yeah, and I'm sure that happened quite a long time before the events from October the 7th onwards. So that's a real difficulty.
Barclays works with other festivals as well. You've got festivals like Latitude and Download. So it's kind of, will we see similar things with those festivals? It almost seems hypocritical to kind of single out the Great Escape when it's obviously not the only festival working with sponsors that people might consider controversial.
I think there is something about the Great Escape that's different, though. I mean, the Great Escape, as I say, having been quite a few times, it's so much about grassroots, kind of a lot of indie music, a lot of sort of DIY ethos, and a lot of kind of focus on values and focus on sort of principles and all of that stuff, at least on the surface. But I think a lot of people genuinely believe it. This was almost a kind of perfect storm for the Great Escape here, because they had that demographic that's most likely to be sort of vocal about these kind of things, linked with the fact that they had a big corporate sponsor that for some people has been linked to it. So it's very difficult.
We're going to see a lot more of this in the future, especially following on from 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement, where consumers are more than happy to risk it all to be vocal about their stance. I feel like in the past people weren't as vocal and would kind of let things slip under the rug, but with this current generation, if they think something is incorrect, they're going to make sure you know about it. And especially with the demographic of the Great Escape, when you've got so many like-minded people, they're going to kind of bound together and create somewhat of like a mini organization and just stand together in solidarity. And I feel like it's quite interesting that the artists themselves decided to boycott the show instead of the people.
Yeah, and the thing is, there's also pressure on those artists that maybe don't have a particularly strong view on it. Because if you've got 160 acts pulling out, I mean, I don't know how many acts there are at the Great Escape, but that's going to be a big, big proportion of them. Are you then going to feel guilty if you're one of those that plays? So there's that element too. But I think we've got to think about this in terms as well of those big, huge global corporations that have had boycotts in recent times. I mean, around the sort of Israel-Gaza situation, we've had obviously Starbucks, we've had McDonald's, and some of those have taken action as a result of that. But then obviously last year, the famous boycott that happened around Bud Light and the Dylan Mulvaney sort of collaboration, the sort of controversial collaboration there that led to a boycott and had a huge expense on Bud Light's parent company. So this is definitely a really sort of extreme example, I think, of a boycott. But we definitely need to keep in mind that these things are happening a lot more. As was mentioned earlier, they're not going away. But this is a really fascinating case study of how these things can really unravel very quickly.
Yeah, and we must say this isn't the first festival as well. There have been others that this has happened to. But I think, as you say, it causes a real challenge for comms professionals and the impact that business decisions can have that result in your workload and work challenges. Something that was probably a decision made completely out of the comms remit that then falls back on the comms to handle it when problems arise.
Yeah. Culture war is a constant now. That's what it feels like. And it's going to throw up issues for communication professionals for the foreseeable future. So we do have to get used to it. And boycotts is just one way in which it can manifest itself. But, you think back to the Nike controversy with the sort of the blue and purple cross on the of St. George on the football kit to, we've mentioned these boycotts to, the National Trust with their vegan scones and everything else. I mean, it's just the way of the world now. But this is another example of how it throws up challenges for our sector, but also shows how important our sector is to cope with them.
So next up, we're going to look into recruitment in the PR and comms industry. Eliza, you've actually written a piece on this. What can you tell us?
I feel like recruitment in the industry is a little bit complicated at the moment. While some are facing great difficulties, others don't seem to have any trouble. I really think this all boils down to the economy, the importance of a work-life balance, and how people see agencies and organisations as brands. After speaking to a few PR, I've come to realise flexibility has never been more important when it comes to retaining good talent. Tin Man's Mandy Shah said that the middle level has always been notoriously hard to fill. The mindset of younger employees is so different now compared to 5 years ago. A job needs to fit the lives of its people, not the other way around.
In terms of kind of finding it difficult to fill those mid-ranking roles, pretty much everyone I've spoken to has noticed a bit of a COVID skills gap. People who entered the industry in the height of lockdown and were working remotely for maybe even been a year or two without kind of working with their colleagues face-to-face, meeting them, already knowing their team, obviously that would have been really difficult, and it's kind of left an impact, I think, on this whole generation of people who are now climbing the ranks of the industry.
Another thing I noticed was how organizations and agencies need to develop their own brand. People will no longer accept working for brands they don't align with, as we were speaking about earlier. Becoming like B Corp certified or Blueprint accredited is now like seen as a huge flex.
I'd agree with that. It is definitely strong from an ethical standpoint. But there is that argument that sort of the more companies that become B Corps and things like that, the less they're going to stand out. So it's a good thing, obviously, but if that becomes the standard, then it's not really appealing for people to hire because it's just what you expect. I also think in terms of the kind of people looking at the employer brand, after a lot of the mergers and things we've seen recently, some people are arguing that PR agencies need to really think about their character and their personality and kind of have an image that makes people want to work from them. And like from the other point of view, some agencies I think are really looking at wanting to hire sort of in terms of newer talent, big personalities and people who are really going to come in and be the future of PR. I was speaking to someone the other day who said they don't want sort of quiet junior employees. They want these people who are going to come in and sort of take over and have these ideas for the future. I think it works both ways.
I think one of the more serious things I've noticed is you need to pay your staff more if you want to keep them. I've spoken to countless PRs during meetings and they've told me they've been poached by firms offering them higher salaries. And it's difficult to say no when you're offered £10,000 more than you're currently making. A recruiter I spoke to basically observed that some candidates are urgently seeking to increase their basic salaries. And I think this is kind of due to the decreasing values of work bonuses and like stocks in some cases. Also, the cost of living crisis has always been an issue, and so is inflation. To me, soft employment benefits like birthdays off, pizzas on Fridays, seasonal tickets, fruits in the morning and cereal, they're no longer really a luxury or a law to stay in a business.
I think the issue PR has is that it's quite inconsistent with its salaries. There's not that much benchmarking, and I think especially as different agencies promote people at different paces, it's hard to know what a standard salary is. I mean, I've had one person even say that they think like a lot of agencies promote people much too fast these days, which kind of leads to inflated salaries when people don't really have the experience. And then it's difficult when you're moving from one company to another to kind of find the balance and know what sort of a standard salary for your level of experience is.
I feel like employers have it quite difficult at the moment trying to find some nice middle ground.
I just think we're kind of in flux when it comes to the recruitment market at the moment. I mean, we had the Great Resignation, the sort of COVID era Great Resignation that coincided with huge growth in the industry. And in that time, sector agencies, in-house employers were desperate to get people, and you saw this huge wage inflation going on as the industry was growing. Well, one year it was nearly 20%. The top 150 grew one year, and the next year it was, which was 2022, it was pretty high, around 15 or so. So you had these two really, really strong years. But the problem was a lot of agencies did end up probably paying too much, and they were too desperate to sort of get the staff in so they could keep the work. And the problem was later on, you saw a round of redundancies, and this is definitely something we saw last year. I mean, the top 150 research suggests getting on for 1 in 5 agencies probably made redundancies in the 2023 calendar year. So that was obviously a very difficult time, and I don't feel like we're totally out of the woods yet, but I also think redundancy programs have been slowing, but I'm not entirely sure what's going to come next. As you say, there is that problem of the skills gap, sort of post-COVID, because we're 4 years on from first lockdown, just over 4 years. So someone who might join as, say, an account exec sort of first role, they now might ordinarily be wanting to be, say, an account manager, maybe even getting towards account director, although probably not quite yet. Those sort of really crucial roles. And if there's a bit of a kind of skills gap at that point, if they haven't learnt the basics as well, then maybe we're going to see a sort of slight change to the usual order, really. It reminds me a bit of the period after the financial crash. Although I wasn't writing about the industry then, people would talk about it when I joined in 2014. They would say that basically there was a big cut in hiring around sort of 2008, 2009. And it meant that when I started in 2015, so in the sort of mid-2010s, there was a kind of real problem getting strong mid-ranking foot soldiers, if you like, who can just basically keep a lot of comms businesses ticking over and be really strong client handlers and so on. So it almost feels like maybe we're in a similar situation now, but for different reasons. And we've gone through the sort of two huge changes of the Great Resignation, followed by the Great Redundancy in inverted commas. I think that's probably exaggerating a bit, but there were certainly a lot of redundancy programs. And now we're in a sort of a slightly strange phase. So I wonder where it's going to go next.
That's it for today, and if you've enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review wherever you access your podcasts. Noise and Brief goes live every 2 weeks, but in the meantime, you can check out our longer interview-based podcast, Beyond the Noise, which comes out next week. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.